So if you're dealing with hemochromatosis or iron overload, there's not a whole lot of information out there about diet or supplement options that can really help improve your situation. And we talk a lot on this channel about just because a person has some kind of genetic or hereditary issue doesn't mean that's a sentence for misery. There's usually steps a person can take to improve their circumstances. Now, there is no cure for hemochromatosis or iron overload issues, but we're going to talk in this video about steps you can take to improve this situation. Now, remember, I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving anybody medical advice here. I'm just a professional stand-up comic turned nutrition author, because when I lost my voice for 8 years, 23 different doctors couldn't help me figure it out. And part of my problem was that I had hereditary hemochromatosis. So this is a situation where your body just absorbs more iron than it should. And as that iron accumulates, it can cause a whole lot of trouble. It can cause a lot of inflammation. It can cause a lot of oxidation. And you can kind of think of it like just your body rusting from this iron overload problem. So hemochromatosis is very common with people that are of Irish or Scottish descent. I got the bonus. I'm from both, so I really scored the score there when I got my hemochromatosis. But all the inflammation, along with some other issues that were creating inflammation for me, caused my problem where I lost my voice for 8 years and I couldn't talk, and man, did that really suck. So a lot of people deal with inflammatory type situations as this iron accumulates in organs like the heart and the liver and the pancreas. So we'll talk about some of those things as well. But the best way to understand if this is a problem for you, but also how you're doing with the situation, is to get a full iron panel. And when you get your annual blood work done, you can usually just ask your doctor, can you do a full iron panel? They kind of stopped doing this a decade or two ago just because it reduces costs when they leave it out. But when you ask for it, they'll usually give that to you. And if it costs a little bit more, it can be worth it just to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. But you really want to look at that full iron panel so you can look at, the total iron binding capacity, the iron saturation, all your ferritin levels. All those things can really give you an idea of how severe the situation was. Now, 23 different doctors couldn't figure out that I had this problem, and even one looked at my iron numbers and was like, "Are you eating a lot of spinach?" And I said, "No," and he was like, "Okay, just don't start," and kind of left it at that. So before we get into some of these dietary and supplement type options that can really help, the first thing I want to make sure people know that are dealing with this issue is that the most effective step is phlebotomy. It's bleeding. So donating blood can be more effective than just about anything else that you can do. And what a lot of people don't know, and this was not available when I first was diagnosed with my hemochromatosis issue, is that you can have a doctor now in most states and in most countries, they can prescribe donating blood more often. In most cases, you can only donate blood about every 56 days because they want to make sure that a person is accumulating enough iron and other nutrients that they lose in that donation process. So it's about every 56 days, but if someone's iron is really high, they can really benefit from donating more often. So you can have your doctor write a prescription to donate more frequently, and that can help you get those iron levels down a lot faster. And most people with hemochromatosis won't even experience any real iron overload symptoms until they're in their 30s or 40s, because as you're young and you're growing, the body uses a lot more iron for all those growing processes. So that accumulation of iron usually doesn't start to happen until they're a little bit older. And for females, as long as they're menstruating and they're having that monthly cycle of losing iron when they're bleeding, those symptoms can take a lot longer to show up. For most females, they won't show up until after menopause, but it can happen for other reasons before that. But in most cases, for males, it's going to be 30 or 40s when they start to have symptoms, and for females, it will usually be after menopause. Now, when we're looking at dietary choices that are going to be optimal, the first thing to understand is that it's really not optimal to remove all sources of iron. If you remove foods that have iron in them, you're going to also be missing out on a lot of other important nutrients like B12 and folate and things like that. So we don't want to try to just eliminate iron. That's kind of what I did. I was running in horror from anything that had iron in it because I thought if I ate it, I was just going to keel over. So don't view it that way, but we really want to avoid most of these fortified foods. A lot of processed foods are fortified with all these nutrients, and one of the nutrients that they usually put in is iron. And it's usually a synthetic iron that a person is going to be able to absorb a lot easier and going to cause a lot more trouble. So avoiding processed and fortified foods, especially like fortified breakfast cereals and fortified grain breads and all these things. These are the things you really want to avoid because they're putting extra iron in that food. It's much more common to see people that are dealing with a deficiency of iron than it is an iron overload problem. So the world kind of dumps a lot of iron into the food. Into the 80s, they started doing this, and even started doing it into like baby formulas and such. So there's a lot more iron in a lot of these processed and fortified foods, and these are great things to avoid. Now, when we're looking at iron within food, we need to understand that there's what's called heme iron and non-heme iron. And heme iron is found in things like meat and fish and poultry, and heme iron is a lot easier for the body to absorb. So these are foods that are going to cause a higher increase in iron in your body. Non-heme iron is harder for the body to absorb. So things like, spinach and vegetables that can include a lot of iron, this doctor told me, stay away from spinach, but spinach really was not as problematic for me as some of these other factors that we're going to talk about because this is a non-heme iron. Now, if somebody is really in a bad sorts, they might want to avoid most high iron foods at first while they're getting their levels down. But when we're looking at long-term taking care of this situation, the non-heme iron foods like spinach and such are usually not going to be as problematic as a heme iron food that is high in iron like liver or organ meats or even red meat. Organ meats and liver are usually going to be a lot higher than red meat, but red meat is usually higher than things like white meat, poultry and such. So for some people, non-heme iron sources like eggs or lentils or spinach and things like that could be better foods that contain iron for them to consume. Now the next layer of things we want to look at with diet are things that you can include that can help restrict iron absorption. Things like high calcium foods, like maybe yogurt or cheese. Polyphenols can also be helpful that are found in things like tea and coffee. And then high fiber foods like fruits and vegetables. Keep in mind when you're thinking high fiber, you don't want to think like high fiber cereal or bread or whole grains because a lot of those are fortified with more iron. So that can be problematic. Now we also want to think about foods that will magnify iron absorption. The biggest one is fructose, but don't think necessarily of fruit. Fruit has fiber which can kind of counteract the fructose that's in fruit, and the amount of fructose in fruit is pretty low. We want to think more about like fruit juices where all that fiber is removed and there's more fructose there that's available, a lot easier to get in the system. But the real problem can be high fructose corn syrup, which is in pretty much every processed food. You can't even buy a Toyota Corolla without it having high fructose corn syrup in it. So it's everywhere. But you really want to avoid this because these really high levels of fructose have the ability to magnify absorption of iron. Another thing we want to think about is vitamin C can also do this, and so can alcohol. Oh, that's a bummer. Yeah, it's a bummer, but it can be really important when you're trying to get these iron levels down. My iron levels were really at a point where I should have been kind of dead. So when it's really bad, it can be really problematic, and you want to be serious about taking the steps to bring these iron levels down until you get into a range that can be more manageable. Now, one more aspect we want to understand about these high levels of fructose is that they seem to have the ability to make this non-heme iron more absorbable. So now we're taking this stuff that makes us absorb more iron, but it also has the ability to take some of these foods that maybe were not so problematic before and making them more problematic. Like eggs have non-heme iron in there. When I had this issue and didn't know about it, Every night I was having an omelet with a glass of orange juice for some reason. I just wanted to really magnify the problem I was having, I guess, because I was creating some real issues by putting those things together. So we really want to bring down our intake of fructose, which might mean removing all of these processed foods. And we really want to remove things that could be magnifying the problems we're dealing with. Remember, iron overload can cause a lot of liver trouble. So if a person's drinking a lot of alcohol, that's magnifying any liver trouble that's already there and restricting that organ from functioning even more. So we also want to keep in mind of possible insulin resistant type issues. But to put some links to some studies in the description below that show us that we're seeing a lot of insulin resistance when there's an iron overload problem. This iron accumulating in the pancreas seems to have the ability to restrict it from creating insulin the right way and can cause some insulin resistance, leading to things like type 2 diabetes. So when we're looking at the right diet for a hemochromatosis type situation, we really want to look at more than just the iron content. We have to look at other factors. We don't want to make a person more insulin resistant while we're trying to fix this iron overload issue. So we don't want them avoiding all of these, red meat and all these things that are higher in iron and gravitating more towards carbohydrates that are going to magnify an insulin resistance issue that might already be there. So just try and look at your entire picture to get an idea of what's really going to be best for you when it comes to diet. But generally speaking, when we're looking at an optimal diet, we're really looking at a situation where it's probably going to be real food, so no processed foods, no fortified foods. You're going to want to include plenty of fiber from fruit and vegetable sources. You're probably going to want to reduce your organ meat intake. That's going to be a very high level of iron in there. And most people with hemochromatosis want to avoid raw shellfish. Not only are these high in iron, but they also have the ability to expose you to a bacteria that seems to really thrive in high iron sources. So when I had this issue going on, I was working in an oyster bar, eating raw oysters every day. I was like trying to jump off a building or something. I was doing everything wrong that I possibly could, but it's a good idea to avoid raw shellfish in this scenario. You may also want to include some polyphenols, whether that be tea or coffee, or maybe like berries. Blueberries are a great source, apples are a great source, cherries, and vegetables like onions, broccoli, cauliflower, and artichokes. Including those polyphenols can help restrict the absorption of that iron a little bit. Now, let's look a little bit at some supplements that can be beneficial. There's some supplements that are said to help kind of chelate the iron and kind of pull it out of the body. Some of those can be bentonite clay, or montamilinite clay is also known as, EDTA, and IP6. All of these are known to kind of pull iron out of the body, but we want to keep in mind that they also have the ability to pull minerals out of the body. So these aren't things I like to use a whole lot. If someone's in a really bad situation and they really need to get those numbers down faster than they can donate blood, then these seem to have the ability to be helpful temporarily. But if you're going to use these, you really want to keep an eye on your blood pressure and make sure that it doesn't go too low. When the systolic number, or that top number, starts to go below 112, that's a sign that it's kind of going too low because maybe minerals are going too low. So you kind of want to keep an eye and maybe supplement with some extra minerals or broad-based mineral supplements to kind of lift those minerals as you're chelating a lot of this stuff out. But when we're looking at supplements, we really want to look to avoid things that include more iron. Most multivitamins include more iron, so you want to make sure you're avoiding anything that includes iron like that. Ashwagandha is also a popular supplement now, and that has some iron in it and can have the ability to raise iron a little bit. So you just want to be aware. It's not going to be as bad as eating like liver or something like that, but you want to be aware of that if you're using ashwagandha. But here's what you really want to keep in mind. Like consuming red meat and some of these higher iron foods is not going to be anywhere near as bad as donating blood can be beneficial. So when you're like eating a serving of red meat, you're probably going to bring in like 2 to 4 milligrams of iron. But when you donate blood, you can remove up to like 250 milligrams of iron. So you can see, if you have the ability to donate blood a little bit more often, keep an eye on your iron levels so you understand when to start slowing down, then it allows you to eat some of these foods that you want to eat that could be problematic if you weren't doing anything. So when my iron levels were high, I was donating blood like every 2 to 3 weeks. But as things came down and got a little bit more under control, now I only donate blood every month or 2 or maybe even 3 months if things are going really well. So I kind of keep an eye on things. I found a little at-home meter that is not really giving your total iron number, but it can kind of give you an idea of where your iron is, and so I check it at home before I go to donate. And if I check it and it seems a little bit higher than normal, then I'm like, oh, maybe I need to donate a little earlier than I thought I was going to. So just keep in mind that initially you might need to avoid a lot more of these foods that are problematic. You might need to include a lot more of these foods that can help restrict iron absorption. But as you get things under control, you can include those foods and it's not going to be a big problem as long as you're donating regularly enough. And keep in mind that when you first start to donate, you might do some blood tests again, a couple months later, and you won't really see a lot of progress. And that's because when iron is high in the blood, it will get deposited into these organs. And so when we start pulling iron out of the blood, then the body starts pulling some of these deposits back into the blood out of the organs so that it doesn't create so much trouble, but your blood numbers are still going to seem high. Just know that you're likely making progress, but you're pulling a lot of backed up iron out of the system. So just be patient with yourself and know that it can take some time. So now that my iron is in a good range, I don't use any of those supplements. I don't restrict any of the foods that I really want to eat. I don't use all these polyphenols on purpose just to restrict iron absorption. I am able to keep everything in a good range just by donating at an appropriate time. So I hope that gives you some insights that'll really help manage the situation for you. And if you want to learn more about how to check your iron levels at home, you can jump over and check out our video on how to check iron at home. I can't wait to hear about your results.